start.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you, everybody, for coming along to this. I'm Jonathan Beale. I'm the BBC's defence correspondent, and I'll be chairing this. We've got a great panel for you. And the subject we're going to look at is the way open source monitoring and investigations can support, strengthen reporting of civilian harm in conflicts. We've got representatives of what I call the old media, and sort of the open source investigations that are taking place at the moment, and some that are very current. I should point out to you that Amnesty is about to publish its investigation into the bombing of Raqqa, which has involved hundreds of people, universities across the world, and as you go out, you can grab on the table back there one of these which tells you about the exhibition that they're going to be putting on and which opens later this week. Am I right in saying later this week?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow, okay, great. So I'll just go through the panel. Chris Woods, founder and director of Airwars, which has tracked civilian deaths in Iraq, Syria and Libya. Chris previously worked for the BBC at Newsnight and Panorama. He also set up the Bureau Investigative Journalism's award-winning Drones Project back in 2010. He's also written a book, Sudden Justice, which charts the history of armed drones since 9/11. Next to Chris is Rawan Shaif, who is the Yemen researcher for Bellingcat, who are also doing their own Yemen strikes project at the moment. And she's been working on that just before she took the seat there. A background in freelance media, journalism and documentary filmmaking in Yemen, and she's focused on reporting the human costs of the Saudi-led war there. She's also written, worked for a number of news organizations, including Al Jazeera English, Global Post, Sky, New York Times as well, and worked also for MSF and various UN agencies too. Next we've got Anthony Loyd, fresh from finding Ms. Begum in Syria. And of course Anthony has been reporting from conflict zones since the early 90s, I think I'm right in saying. Started in Bosnia. He's since reported in Libya, Afghanistan, Iraq, and as I said, most recently Syria. He's also author of My War Gone By, I Miss It So, and Another Bloody Love Letter. And he now is, of course, the senior foreign correspondent for the Times. And then finally, Milena Marin, who has over 10 years' experience working on human rights, on public sector transparency, anti-corruption, open data. She's been leading Amnesty Decoders, which is a platform using crowdsourcing, artificial intelligence, to process and analyze large volumes of data, including satellite imagery, pictures, and documents. And as I say, she's just been involved in this very large project for Amnesty, which will be launched tomorrow. Previously, she worked as program manager of School of Data, where she trained and mentored numerous NGOs and journalists around the world to make the most of their data and reach new audiences. She also worked for Transparency International. So what we're going to do is we're going to let each of our panel, and we'll probably go that way, so we'll start with Chris, to speak for entirely up to them, 5 or 10 minutes. And then we'll leave plenty of time afterwards for your questions. So Chris, why don't you kick off?
Thanks, Adam, and thanks for coming along, everyone. The focus, I think, on a lot of the time on open source intelligence, how it affects and changes our understanding of civilian harm, which is what we're talking about tonight, often, I think, focuses on the technical aspects of that, the data, the satellite imagery analysis, and so on. And I think actually what it's really about is listening to the communities who are under fire. That's really what open source is about, capturing is what those communities themselves are experiencing and reporting. For those who don't know Airwars, we were set up back in 2014 in response to a kind of existential crisis, really, with modern militaries that they seem incapable of determining civilian harm from their own actions. If you remember, after NATO 2011, NATO's claimed we killed 0 civilians in the entire war. And when you push them on that, they didn't believe that they killed 0 civilians, they just didn't know where the civilians they'd killed had been. And it kept coming back to this when we engaged. The CIA was claiming 0 civilian harm from its strikes in Pakistan. And you know, we've seen in the war against ISIS this narrative of our strikes are so precise we don't harm civilians anymore. I think my favourite British moment was when former British Defence Secretary, what was his name? Michael Fallon was on the Today programme, and he was puffing up the Brimstone missile. It was a great British invention. And he told John Humphreys, you know, British science is so brilliant, we've invented a missile that no longer harms civilians. And Humphreys let it go, you know. So Airwars was formed really to say, well, okay, so you've got militaries claiming this. The traditional way that we engage on civilian harm is to wait for the field investigators, for the reporter to come, for the field investigators to come and make a detailed forensic determination of what has taken place, often a significant time lag after the event. And we set ourselves the task of, can you monitor what communities themselves are saying in near real time, or even real time, capture that information, preserve that information, and get a clearer, closer local understanding of harm. And that's what Airwars has done. For the coalition alone, US-led coalition alone in Iraq and Syria, we've tracked locally alleged more than 29,000 deaths from coalition actions, 25,000 deaths from Russian actions. Each of these built from the ground, local communities, often talking just among themselves, because nobody's really listening more broadly than their local communities. Nobody cares. Nobody cares about civilian harm on the scale that it's been occurring in places like Iraq and Syria, except in those local communities. So you capture that information. I think that where things have got really interesting for us is, so Airwars began that process, and over time it's become a more and more collaborative journey. It's become something that we do in partnership with news organizations, with organizations like Amnesty, where each of us has a part of the picture, and open source is a critical part of the picture, but it's not, and it can never be the whole picture. But when you put that open source together with the field investigation, with the satellite analysis, with the military's own understanding, then we start to get a much more comprehensive understanding. And where militaries themselves refuse to talk to us, or where they lie to us, you can undercut their claims in quite a substantial way. And I think one of the successes of Airwars with its approach has been to force the US military in particular to change its own modelling of civilian harm. We pushed them out of their own comfort zone where they would admit, 1 or 2 deaths in a conflict. And so far they've admitted, I think, just under 1,300 deaths for the war against ISIS, far under the public record and where we think the actual number is, but still far different. You only have to go back to the previous Iraq war and that infamous statement, we don't do body counts, which of course is where Iraq body count took its name from. So I think open source is critical, it's growing. I don't think it will ever replace the reporter in the field, but I think it complements the reporter and the investigator in the field. And it's the partnership that's actually creating some of the most interesting breakthroughs and developments at the moment.
Great. Rawan.
Yeah, so definitely echoing what Chris said about open source not being the end-all means, but rather very, very complementary. Right now at Bellingcat, we're doing something very similar to what Airwars has been doing for the last 3 years and have been doing very, very well, but using the conflict in Yemen as the base for our investigations. And so I come from a completely different background, which is ground investigations, and that is what I relied on for my information. But when I left, accessibility was difficult. You have one of the most underreported conflicts in the world, And the reason as to why this happens is because of accessibility. Reporters find it difficult to access Yemen. NGOs find it difficult to access Yemen. And so instead what you find is this rhetoric that because it is hard to access, it is therefore not worthy of coverage. And so one of our aims with the investigation and the project that we're launching at Bellingcat right now was to overcome that obstacle, to start looking at open source content, to verify events and to confirm them, and to also investigate them, even ones that hadn't been investigated previously. And that actually stems from a lack of transparency. In Airwars' case, they still had data from the military to go over. In our case, we have the Saudi-led coalition, and out of the 16,000 airstrikes that YDP has documented, only 172 have been investigated by the Saudi-led coalition, and out of those 172, most of them they deny even existed. And so when you have an air campaign that's being conducted in that manner, it's difficult to verify events. And so what we did was we created this methodology and collection protocol on how to investigate airstrikes systematically based on an evidentiary standard. And that evidentiary standard is the one that we have reviewed with lawyers as now the highest possible evidentiary standard without overwhelming investigators. But the things that we've been finding have almost been incredible in a sense where we're confirming that double tap strikes happened even though people had visited this site, or we're seeing munitions or craters that can only be consistent with airstrikes. And these are all investigations that the Saudi-led coalition have either said did not happen, or airstrikes that did not happen. And part of that comes from collaboration. We were only able to do this because of people like Amnesty in the room, and others who sat down for 3 days in January, and it was like the who's who of open source. And everyone sat in a room for 3 days, went over a list of 100 strikes, and was constantly hammering away based on this methodology and collection protocol to confirm this. And this is incredibly important because the UK and the US rely entirely on JIAT. They claim that JIAT are the Joint Investigative Assessment Team that are run by the Saudi-led coalition. They are run by the Saudi-led coalition, however, they say that they are independent. And the UK and the US rely on that information as the one that they're basing all their policy off. This is problematic for various reasons, one being that that is the only source of information. People like Amnesty and Human Rights Watch have been discredited by the government recently in the CAT appeal, and also previously by the MP who's in charge for arms exports, saying that those reports aren't credible. But the idea with open source is to be able to tell people like that, well, if we can do it sitting in our rooms, following a methodology and following a collection protocol, then it clearly can be done by the government, who claims that civilian casualties can't be monitored and that NGOs aren't doing their best job to be impartial. And so it definitely, like, open source definitely fixes problems like this. It is an incredible tool, but it is not the end to all means. I definitely miss being in Yemen every single day. But one of my colleagues says all the time at Bellingcat that, like, the only limitation with open source is your imagination. It is amazing the amount of stuff that we find on Yemen, and despite Yemen not being incredibly well connected to the internet, despite it not having as much open source content as places like Syria and Iraq, but there is still so much that we end up drowning in and having to filter every single day. Like, some of the incident assessments that we're doing are 56 pages long, purely by verifying user-generated content, and that kind of content is available to everyone. And so it's an interesting way forward, and it's a field that's changing almost every single day. And the accessibility to information is also changing. It's no longer traditional in the sense that only investigators on the ground can do this. And in fact, I see the ideal investigation, the ideal report, the ideal breaking news coverage should be a blend between open source and ground investigations. That is the most ideal thing. But our role at Bellingcat is to work on the open source so that we can help everyone else do this. We can help the journalists, and it is very, very collaborative in that sense.
Thank you. And Anthony's going to give us a perspective from the ground, I suppose.
I will give a perspective from the ground, and also start helpfully by saying quite how bad my initial experience was with open source investigations, but and how that has changed to the point now where it's a very integral relationship actually between working on the ground and consulting and sometimes collaborating with organisations like Airwars. I find it a very trusted relationship, and their presence alongside my reporting is a very credible one and is of huge use to me. But I'll start off with a case history which is quite interesting, because war has changed so much in the use of some weapon types in the last 7 years. And at the beginning, all of us field reporters in Syria, as well as open source investigators, were floundering, particularly in the field of chemical weapons. So I'll just give you this quick case history because it's quite interesting, and allows me to dole a bit of shit back too. So in April 2013, I've been working in Syria quite a lot, and there was a report of a chemical weapons attack in northern Aleppo, in an area called Sheikh Maqsood. Now, these are very, very early days in the history of chemical weapons attacks in Syria. The bigger attacks in Ghouta and all the rest of it, they haven't yet happened. These are the first testing attacks that the Assad regime are using in specific areas to see what the Western response will be, if any at all. So in April 2013, which was a few months after President Obama had made his red line remarks over the use of chemical weapons in Syria, there is this report of an attack in Sheikh Maqsood, and I was quite near to where it had happened, so I went there. And it was, Aleppo in those days was a very unpleasant place to work. There was a lot of fighting, a lot of violence, a dangerous place. But we got to the area about 4 days after the strike had happened and discovered a number of things. One projectile had come through an awning in the roof of a 2-story home. And it had come through at great speed, as it had been dropped out of the sky. It had smashed straight through the awning and detonated on a stairwell. And there had been a family of 5 inside. A garage mechanic who was, I think he's about 27, called Yasser Yunus, his wife, a couple of kids, and a sister-in-law. And gas had come out of this projectile and killed the wife and the 2 infant boys. And 13 rescuers had been affected by this gas. So we went off to the clinic where they'd been treated, spoke to the doctors who had treated them, found Yasser Yunus, who had survived, who'd been dosed up with atropine and survived, spoke to other survivors. But then the key thing was we got video from the doctors of the casualties being treated. They were foaming and frothing at the mouth, repeated sort of tremors consistent with nerve agent poisoning, hallucinating, repetitive movements and all the rest of it. We also had photographs of what was left of the device. So we put this to various people, but everything suggested that some sort of nerve agent had been used. This was consistent as well with the Americans at the time. It was Chuck Hagel who came out saying there was emerging evidence that the regime were using nerve agent. So we ran with this story, and it was a big story because it was one of the first slam dunk cases where you had survivor testimony, visual documentation in videos and photographs, and photographs of the actual what was left of the device. No sooner we run with the story, we're quite pleased with ourselves, that Elliot Higgins, who at that stage was running Brown Moses, is like, well, hang on, wait a minute. What's left of this device doesn't look like anything you could disseminate sarin with. It looks like some sort of riot control agent. No sooner had he said that, already Brown Moses had some credibility, that you got mainstay, what I would regard as not hugely credible defense industry magazines like CBRNE World saying, oh yeah, maybe the journalists just smudged the foam on the casualties as part of some sort of setup, which was extremely insulting and extremely disingenuous as well. So this early case got taken completely off the rails. In fairness to Elliot, none of us really knew at the time how sarin gas was being disseminated in those early strikes. They weren't often using Soviet-style CW munitions to do it. They were experimenting with new ways of doing it. They were dropping canisters out of helicopters and all the rest of it. So they had used an old riot-control canister, but with sarin in it. And I know this because the Brits got samples from the site. A journalist from Libération who turned up after me got samples back to France. The Americans got samples. The Brits was tested in Porton Down, all proved unequivocally that it was a sarin nerve gas attack, and it was a very important one. It was the first real breach of Obama's red line. But unfortunately, in fairness to Elliot, he didn't really know how this sort of stuff was being used at that time, had come to a conclusion, which then got jumped on by defence industry magazines here, who certainly didn't have a clue because they didn't have anything in Syria, and wouldn't have known really much better than Soviets, more information than weapon systems related to Soviet-style eras. And so that was a disastrous first start. However, since then, in fairness, you know, Elliot became infinitely more sophisticated. Bellingcat are far different league to Brown Moses. We all learned a lot, and in fairness, in those days, I didn't really know what a nerve agent, you know, means of dissemination was either. But those days have changed dramatically now, and I will find myself either looking at the Bellingcat site or consulting with Airwars regularly to find out information using analysis and assessment methods or geolocation that I wouldn't know how to do. And I find it is a very, very good and strong tandem relationship. Milena.
Yes, Milena.
I mean, I can only agree with everything that's been said, of course. The privilege of being the last. Well, so at Amnesty, I'm part of Amnesty's crisis response team, and I think we are in a really unique and very privileged position to have the both worlds. So we have a team of highly skilled field investigators that can deploy on the ground very quickly. Very different than any other Amnesty researcher and investigator. Typically, we're known for taking years to complete an investigation. You know, when the facts are over, 2 years on, maybe Amnesty will put out a report. The team I'm in is really trying to change that game and be there as things are happening. And in addition to our field investigators, we have a team that I'm part on. We're called the Evidence Lab. And we bring together the remote analysis and the open source analysis in tandem with the field investigation. And that's really, really groundbreaking because we can talk to our investigators while they are on the ground and help them. They hear reports from people, and as they take testimonies, we can already help corroborate those testimonies as they are in the field. So we use remote sensing, satellite imagery analysis, weapons analysis, and we can really inform the field investigation. And of course, when they come back, we can really, bring their evidence to a new level. And our goal as human rights organization is to achieve change. So we always, it's not just to expose facts. So in that sense, we're different from a journalistic endeavor. We're there to have like an advocacy goal for change. So for us, having a very high level of evidentiary standard is really important. And what we found is that remote sensing, open source investigations are really strengthening our case. And it's not just about the testimonies from the ground, which can sometimes be easily dismissed by governments, by military, by corporations. It's really bringing that level of irrefutable evidence. They can't really argue with satellite imagery. They can't really argue when you show them, a verified report from the ground. And we've seen that slowly we're changing narratives. You may have seen the work we've done together with the BBC, The Anatomy of a Killing. It won an award today again. It's that, you challenge the rhetoric and you bring that high level of evidence that they just can't deal with. It's irrefutable and that's it. Maybe just very quickly, the project I work on and that I specialize on, and it's a bit unique in this space, has to do with democratizing open source. I find that, it's a new trend in journalism. and in investigations is probably what data journalism was a few years ago. Now everybody wants to be an open source investigator. And I find that it can be really easy that there are created these kind of niches, and I want open source to be used by everybody, and we're pioneering this project called Amnesty Decoders. Is a crowdsourcing project where we're engaging thousands of people in open source investigations. So with our Raqqa project that is launching tomorrow, we looked at over 11,000 buildings in Raqqa that were damaged or destroyed, and we engaged 3,000 people from over 100 countries to look at satellite images over time and identify exactly when those buildings were destroyed. So it's no longer a domain of experts. We are having our own in-house remote sensing analyst, but we're engaging as well tens of thousands of people from around the world to do that for us, and we do it quicker. We do it at scale. We've never been able to look, we look at 10, 100 buildings. We can never look at 11,000 buildings, but now that we have this project, it's kind of all hands on deck, and we engage people around the world. But maybe before I conclude, one really important thing that nobody had mentioned is open source comes with risks. There's the risk of secondary trauma. If we talk again about the BBC video, that was the killings video in Cameroon. It was one of the hardest video to watch. It was Cameroonian soldiers marching 2 women and 2 children on a dirt road in Cameroon. One of the women had a child on her back. The other one was carrying a little girl in her hands, and they were shot in the video. We had to watch that video hundreds of times to verify where it was, to geolocate it, frame by frame. And that can be incredibly traumatic. And again, like everybody wants to be an open source investigator, but we really have to talk about how we deal with trauma. And yeah, just an important point to raise.
Can I just quickly ask you about the project you're launching tomorrow? You say 3,000 people involved. How do you know that everybody is giving you the right information? How do you sort of regulate it or police it, or so at the end of the process that you know what you've got is the best information possible?
Sure. Well, first of all, that's just one side of a multi-layered investigation. So we're working with Airwars as well, bringing all the data from social media reports, and the analysis of satellite images was a layer of a larger investigation. So the methodology we use, so it's called microtasking. It's taking a very large task, so imagine a satellite image of a city, and we break it into smaller microtasks and distribute these tasks over the internet. Every single task is done by multiple people, so there's redundancy built into the system, and we're checking with statistical means agreement in the crowd. And of course, you'll always have like some tasks that even experts won't agree, like very minute damage to a building, people won't pick it up. But we've seen quite good quality of data. We've done analysis on a similar project in Darfur where we were looking for destroyed buildings, destroyed villages, and we found that 90% of the data was of very high quality. So yeah, using statistical means, using spot checks, and not relying just on that. So it's part of a larger investigation.
Great. I think I open it up to questions. If you've got a point to make, try and keep it short as well as the question. So I'll open it up now. Is anybody going to kick off? Who's a brave person? Great. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a fantastic panel. Someone mentioned that satellite imagery can't lie. And I find that a really interesting statement when you think about further analysis, because I would argue, of course, right, imagery can lie about politics. So I wonder whether you and how you are thinking about giving everything an extra analytical angle beyond the verification of events and of how things unfolded. What do you do, or what is missing maybe at the moment in open source investigations, understanding politics, history, motivations, all these underpinning things that still drive the events about which we know much more thanks to you. Thanks.
Do you want to kick off with that one, Chris?
There are others here who work a lot with satellite images, and I'll leave them to answer that. I would actually say one of the potential traps of open source is we become over-dependent on what we call the observable. it requires something to have been captured, observed, seen, and as we saw at Mosul and Raqqa, for example, catastrophic civilian harm. During the Battle of Mosul, minimum 12,000 civilians killed by all parties to fighting. Most of the civilians who died in buildings when buildings came down on them. Nobody filmed that, nobody captured that. There's no way of observing that. We can observe the damage to the building. We can't actually observe the event itself. It's the same dilemma that militaries have, actually. And one of the reasons why we have these huge gulfs between public understanding civilian harm and military understanding civilian harm. And that's why open source, in my view, it has to be alongside the field investigations wherever you can. It has great value on its own when you can't get in on the ground, which is often most of the time. I mean, it was almost two and a half years before we saw any kind of substantial on-the-ground field investigations in Iraq. That was 2.5 years where the coalition, ISIS, could pretty much do what they want without being under investigation. But I think, by its very nature, open source requires something to have been observed, captured, some change to have been to have occurred, some difference, something has altered, and it's that we look for. And it misses those narratives from the communities and from the survivors, from the victims, and so we can never. I think the risk is being entirely dependent on open source. It risks significantly under counting civilian harm, and as a good example, so we've been partnering with Amnesty on the Raqqa project, launching tomorrow. Amnesty spent the equivalent of 2 months on the ground in Raqqa. The coalition claimed they couldn't get there. They were occupying it, but they claimed they couldn't get there to investigate. Amnesty, to their enormous credit, 2 months on the ground. 25% more cases were found by Amnesty just from engaging with the civilians they spoke with on the ground than Airwars had captured by listening to those communities during the conflicts. In Iraq, where the quality of local reporting has been far worse than Syria, there really isn't that kind of local network of monitors, analysts, like the Syrian network, Syrian Observatory, Raqqa's being slaughtered silently, and so on. We saw huge disparities between what was being picked up locally by reporters and what was being reported out locally. And actually, one of the most telling statistics is the coalition itself, the civilian deaths it's admitted in Iraq. Half of all those deaths were never reported by Iraqis themselves during the fighting. That's a terrifying number in my view. I mean, that suggests we could be profoundly underestimating the civilian harm we and others have just caused in Iraq simply by the absence of local reporting. So for me, it's always it's what you see and it's what you don't see that's the risk as well.
And Rawan, you got experiences of both reporting from the ground, but also doing your investigation now with Bellingcat, and just try and draw out the sort of differences and the sort of pitfalls of each.
So especially about satellite imagery, even whilst I was in Yemen, and so during my time in Yemen, I had documented 130 airstrikes. Some were for Amnesty, some for SEF, but I was still actually relying on satellite imagery, even though I was there, because satellite imagery is a really good way of verifying a first question in an investigation, which is where something happened. And if a building has been bombed, you can definitely show that on satellite imagery. It's a reliable source of information, much more than witness testimonies, and it's one that definitely would stand up legally much more than witness testimonies as well, because you can't tamper with the satellite imagery. You may have difficulties accessing a satellite image because of cost, but the ones that are available, like Google Earth Pro, who frequently update things with Digital Globe depending on the location, you will rely on that much more than witness testimonies. You are limited, the same way Chris said. I will find that whilst I'm doing open source investigations for Bellingcat, and whilst my team has been doing them on the Yemen project, I might have to disagree with Chris on one thing, especially on the Yemen context. I am still incredibly surprised by how much open source content there is. I found that in every single strike, someone was documenting something. There is so much documentation on Yemen. It's like, for me, I'm completely drawn back away from it. And I think that's because of the narrative and the context of the war, in which there is a need to document it. There are groups on Facebook with like 80,000 people, where every single day or every single time a strike happens, someone will post something, and you'll find about 80 different pictures from a different scene or from the same scene. So sometimes there is that, but in other areas that are difficult to reach because of internet, like Sada, which is up in the north, you'll find less content, but there is still content that exists. And like there's this theory that I now have, which is someone somewhere is always documenting something. Like that is just a standard. It just depends on how you look for it, and the words that you use. So like the different types of searches that you use. You can either use image-based searches or word-based searches. Most of this content is in Arabic, so you have to be searching for it in Arabic, but you also have to be thinking like the person who's posting it. So let's say a party to the conflict will post something in a completely different way than a civilian would. A party to the conflict would use very specific terminology, like the Saudi aggression has just killed 100 civilians. And that, for most of my colleagues, is very difficult to find because they don't really know the context. And so they're like, what is the Saudi aggression video? But it ends up being footage from a strike. And a civilian will post something based on their location. So a civilian will say something like, my house was just bombed, and you have to basically modify your search to dates rather than actual words so that you can find incidents based on that date. But most of this comes from ground knowledge. Like, I wouldn't be able to do any of it had I not spent time on the ground. And a lot of it is corroborating sources. So building a methodology where you say that one source is not enough to identify an incident happened, but 6 or 7 become very difficult to dismiss. 6 or 7 using different tools, whether it be Marine tracker for bombings of ports, whether videos or satellite imagery or tweets or Facebook posts. Those are still sources. And part of our methodology is actually to work on verifying user-generated content first, to then corroborate with NGO and media reports. And so it has its limitations, but right now I definitely don't feel limited by it. Ask me again in like 6 months' time. But so far it's been overwhelmingly good. And most of my colleagues who've worked on Syria, who've done quite things that are similar to what Airwars have done, have found that actually Yemen is a lot easier in the sense that because there's not that much content, it's easier to filter through and verify. But different conflicts have different contexts, and it changes.
I mean, Anthony, you mentioned that you use you go to Airwars or Amnesty or other groups to sort of get more information about it.
Not always get, sometimes give. I mean, I think one really good.
Well, does that ever generate a story for you? In that a lot of your stuff is going to be human stories, and I just wonder how much of that is originated. I mean, it's from what you see on the ground more likely than.
Well, I tell you, to put this in some context from my point of view, which bounces off what's been said here, but particularly what Chris said about an event being seen. So take it, let's see, the Battle of Mosul, March 2017. I happened to be in this area in West Mosul, and I was at a clinic, and the battle's ongoing. It's really, really intense. It's 2/3 of the way into the battle. Swathes of the city destroyed. Clinics are quite good place to go to see what's going on because they're very near to the front line. It's just like 2 blocks back. And you can see by who's coming through, whether it's soldiers, whether it's civilians, and then find out how they've died. So first of all, what I want to say is one of the characteristics of that war is that you're dealing with Islamic State, who embrace death. They want civilians to die. They're quite happy to use civilians as human shields, and they're quite happy to kill civilians who are trying to leave their areas. So that's a start point, which makes it also very difficult to deal with Islamic State. But what you don't do is drop heavy munitions on a roof where you see 2 snipers, which occurred in the case I'm just about to describe. I was working in this clinic, and suddenly droves of wounded and dead started coming through. And it's pretty dramatic when you see them. So a pregnant woman turns up, she's very badly injured, she dies, then the woman she's with is like, oh, I've got to call her relatives. So they've just escaped from Islamic State area. They say they've been hit by some sort of airstrike which has caused the whole street to blow up. So the woman who wants to tell her relatives about her dead friend pulls a bar of soap out of her pocket and breaks that in half because there's a SIM card inside. It's hidden there because she didn't want Islamic State to find it, which would have got her in trouble. So that's how they pass, word of death. Then some guy turns up with his leg hanging off. He bleeds out. They get him and his leg away, but the shoe remains. And then some bloke comes up and says, that's my brother's shoe. Where's my brother? So you have to say, no, sorry, brother's dead. That's his shoe, but his body's over there. And then other people turn up, dead, dying. It's really intense, really chaotic. So you speak to the staff and say, we've got, it's like this all the time. And they're like, no, something's happening. We're speaking to the wounded. And they're all talking about this street in Mosul, Jadida, that they've been pulled from, which has gone up. The whole street is there describing it. And they're saying to me, look, hundreds of people are trapped in rubble, crying out. It's getting quite hot already. There's hundreds of people dead and dying there. It's very difficult to know what actually I'm looking at. So the first thing that goes wrong is I say to the fixer, right, well, let's get the 2 blocks up to the front to see the street. So the fixer starts bridling because he's mates with the local commander. And the local commander, who we do get to see, is clearly aware that something very badly wrong has happened with an airstrike, that hundreds of civilians are dead and wounded. And the last thing he wants is a British journalist on his case saying, look, the whole street's, destroyed. There's people clambering at the ruins, getting shot at by Islamic State snipers. The commander doesn't really want to tell me what's going on. The fixer's not helping. But I've got enough of a story to write. And I had a conversation with Chris within, I would say, 2 or 3 days, or certainly an email exchange about it. Now, I'm not saying that my story was the first that would have triggered then his overwatch onto that incident. It became a very infamous incident, and that it was the largest single strike cause of civilian deaths, which killed, I think, at least 120 people that the Americans
admitted to. 140 they conceded.
And maybe a lot more. But this is an incident where subsequently Chris's assets and analysis became absolutely key to what had happened. But in the first instant, and it doesn't happen like this every time, it was a journalist. It might not have been me, it might have been another journalist, but raised up this issue, which then caused open source investigators to look at it more closely. So, I mean, it can be symbiotic. It's not me just looking at the Airwars site to go, oh, well, look, that's something that's happened. That looks like a good story. I'll follow up on it. I mean, it can be both ways. It can be open source can be an element of a story that I'm writing about. It can be a group that I contact saying, hey, you want to have a look at this? Or it can be a group that I look at to see if I can follow up on a story. So there's 3 sort of strands to the relationship. I think that's fair to say. Feel free to.
Yeah, I mean, the Jadida case was extraordinary. I mean, so the entire neighborhood was wiped out, and we still don't really understand it. We know of a very significant number of civilians died, probably around 500 died over a 72-hour period. But the bombardments were so ferocious. It was ISIS bombardments, coalition bombardments, Iraqi government bombardments, and over a 72-hour period, that street went. And I think one of the challenges was untangling the destruction and death there. But I think, Anthony, you were one of the only journalists who ever got to the scene while there were still bodies on site, because they locked that down very quickly. And I think you had one of the few eyewitness perspectives of that. But I agree that it can be symbiotic. We get calls from journalists before they go to an area saying, look, we're going into this area. What kind of things are you monitoring? Is there a particular neighborhood that's under stress or challenge? We're also very grateful to journalists when they come out for sharing with us and saying, this is what we found, this is what we saw. And then we can then leverage that with the coalition saying, stop this, or, investigate this. And the other fascinating thing for me for Jadida and the whole catastrophe of March 2017, the coalition dropped more munitions on that one part of West Mosul in 1 month than they dropped in all of Afghanistan. The Americans dropped in all of Afghanistan that year. It was 5,000 munitions went into this tiny neighborhood in 1 month. And there was an uproar. There's an absolute uproar at the very high civilian toll, and significantly because of reporters like Anthony in the field saying this is just, you know, out of control, the destruction here. We saw a 30% drop in munitions fired into Mosul the following month. And we saw a 30% drop in locally reported civilian deaths. It was the strongest correlation we ever saw between the intensity of bombardment and civilian harm. It really showed to us so clearly what could happen if the media did its job, if we worked together, if we highlighted what was actually happening. And that probably saved a significant number of lives in Mosul, that uproar. I mean, it matters. It's not just a sort of bearing witness. Sometimes it can actually have a positive effect, that intervention, and particularly if it's a tactical intervention. And as Milena mentioned, the great thing about Amnesty's unit is how fast they are now. There is enormous value to NGOs, to investigations going in after the event, but where we can really make a difference is during the event, and that's where open source can really come into its own, because sometimes it's not safe to get in there on the ground at that moment, but you can at least understand the local community's experiences, analyze the destruction through available imagery, satellite imagery, and so on, and potentially save lives. You know, it can't happen all the time, but that's no mean feat, I think.
And Milena, I was just going to follow up and just say that, you know, you gave the example of the work you did with the BBC about that murder. I mean, I just wondered how often are you highlighting stories that the media pick up, and how frustrated do you get that you highlight issues which the mainstream media do not pick up?
Well, our relationship with the media is an interesting one, of course, and it's interesting. Sometimes we work so that the media picks up the stories we write, and that's really important, because Amnesty is one of the biggest human rights organizations out there, but still our ability to really reach out to the masses is limited. And the way we can do that is working with the media, and we have, you know, teams of people dedicated to maintaining media relationships and getting our stories out there. I gotta say, like, we're launching the Raqqa project tomorrow, and I'm terrified that Megan will give birth, and oh my God, nobody will care about our story. So you know, media is important, and media attention and the stories they choose to tell, and how we can influence that, and how sometimes we can't influence that because other things happen in the world. That's terrifying how it's not in our control. But for us to be able to achieve any change, we need many, many people to care about what we're doing and to read the stories we're producing and to empathize with the people that are suffering on the ground. So really, media is key. It's key to us. I wanted to give, going back to satellite images, I think it's really interesting you talked about politics. I think a really interesting context in using satellite images is commercial interests and availability of imagery. Obviously, we have Google Earth Pro, which all of us are using, free imagery. You can use it within the soft terms as much as you want, but obviously you won't have the image from yesterday. And if we're talking about, investigating things live as they happen, there's huge limitations. And maybe an interesting example I have is from Myanmar. Like very early days in Rakhine State, we were seeing lots of people fleeing into Bangladesh, and we really didn't know what was happening. It was portrayed as a refugee, people are fleeing. We didn't really know why they are fleeing, and there were a lot of contrasting narratives out there. So that's an instance where, commercial interest, so satellite imagery works in, there's commercial providers out there, so unless there's commercial or military interest, there won't be images over certain places. So there was no commercial or military interest over Myanmar when people started fleeing. So we only had very, very low resolution satellite imagery over Myanmar. As we started understanding more what was happening, it was imaged very frequently, and we had very high resolution imagery to be able to really determine what's happening. But in the early days, we had to use very low resolution imagery of 15 meters per pixel. But even that was really interesting because we could see those villages that were mixed, how like half of the village was wiped out and the other half was like standing. And that's like the fact that we use that imagery, that we put out there information about what's happening, motivated the commercial companies to take more imagery over Myanmar, and that helped us really do quicker work and really understand the villages that were being burned, the people that were pushed away, and so on. So yeah, it's really interesting, the context of availability of tools and how we rely, open source is not really open because we rely on companies, we rely on the Twitter, the Facebook, the YouTube. Maybe, content removal is a huge issue for us as well. Like videos of blood and gore don't stick on YouTube and we need them.
Has anybody else got a question? If I could take the gentleman in the back there first, thank you.
Just a quick comment and then question. So I thought the Anatomy of a Killing investigation was fascinating, and as someone who's worked in that region and also knows it's very underreported, great credit to you for bringing that to wider awareness. My question is, what practical steps do you think Western militaries should be taking to reduce civilian harm? And I'd just be interested in what relationship, if any, you have with them.
Chris, huh?
Well, I think Chris did actually say that when militaries lie to us, so...
Airwars we're interesting because I guess we will work with militaries when, if they're willing to engage with us and if we think there's a practical outcome of that. And I think also interestingly for Airwars, our focus is mitigation. So the more traditional NGO engagement on civilian harm tends to be the big events, the really egregious events of civilian harm, where IHL, laws of war violations, are most likely, and they matter enormously. And that is, I think, where that significant resource should go. Quite rightly, Airwars' focus is more around every casualty, whether those civilians were lawfully or unlawfully killed. So we track all civilian harm from international military actions in Iraq and Syria. And that's kind of created an opening for us with the American military where, because they don't need lawyers in the room, they talk to us. And it has opened up this space with the Americans where, when they went into the war with ISIS, they were locked into this precision war narrative, as I say, our bombs are so precise, we can't be killing civilians. And of course, it turns out not to be true, but they just didn't know the damage their bombs and missiles were doing. And we've encouraged the Americans in particular into a space between their position and ours, and it's also a space we venture into. So we engage directly with their civilian casualty assessment team in confidence. Abby, my colleague here from Airwars, she works with the coalition, and there's a dialogue there, and it's a confidential dialogue. And it's one where there's not necessarily a right answer on either side, but the US military is willing to explore what is in the public domain and change their opinions. I think we have 5 cases we've recently got them to reopen, and we have hopes that the project with Amnesty on Raqqa, or Amnesty's project on Raqqa, which we're the junior partner on, will get them to reopen hundreds of cases for Raqqa, which they really closed off far too quickly. So militaries can work, with external NGOs, and should. I think the British have their own challenges. The British are much more transparent than the Americans, but they're almost completely unaccountable for civilian harm. So we know from the American data, from the events that the American military has admitted, the Americans admit to killing 1 civilian for roughly every 40 of their airstrikes. The British have conducted 2,000 airstrikes in Iraq and Syria and have admitted 1 death. 1 death. The average size bomb the British have dropped is a 500-pounder for the duration of the war, and most of the British strikes were in densely populated urban environments. There's no way that those British strikes only killed 1 civilian. So something's broken with the Brits, and we would argue that the systemic challenges the Brits have are so profound that they really need to do things very differently. And within the RAF, which is responsible for our engagement in the war against ISIS, I would say there is a groupthink right now that is proving very difficult to dislodge them from. We're very much encouraging MOD to take a good look at what the American military is doing as a better example. It's, we are still, the Raqqa study is putting the real number of civilian deaths from coalition actions at least 10 times what the coalition has admitted but at least they have admitted some deaths there. But if it were a British campaign at Raqqa, British only, they were a presence at Raqqa, I doubt we'd have seen any civilian deaths admitted, and that troubles me.
When Anthony, you spend a lot of time dealing with different militaries. I mean, what would your advice to that question be? I
don't deal with Western militaries in Iraq or Syria anymore because it's a waste of energy and time. Answer out of them. I leave that to defence correspondents. So,
I think you might say the same thing, but yeah.
No, it becomes. My methodology becomes more and more witness testimonials of people on the ground, or to try and see events as they actually occur.
So, in the specific example that you gave earlier of the bombing that killed,
as Chris said, that street was destroyed over a 72-hour period, but there was one particularly catastrophic event, which started when 2 Islamic State snipers were on a roof, which then had a bomb dropped on it, which then detonated something that was beneath the roof, whether it was a munitions stockpile or whether it was a suicide vehicle waiting to be driven off later. I wasn't quite sure, but that's how it started. But why drop a bomb on 2 snipers on a roof? Shoot them.
To be fair to the military, they did actually investigate that particular. they sent people on the ground, didn't they?
The only investigation, the only ground investigation of the entire war against ISIS. So a war that lasted longer than World War I, and once the coalition put people in on the ground to investigate civilian harm. I just find that astonishing.
Yeah, they are really quick to dismiss everything as non-credible without having first-hand information.
On a serious,
relying as well on others.
On a serious note, the gap between Western militaries and journalists is greater now than at any time I've seen, I think, in the last 10 years. What I say is true. I don't waste my time trying to speak to British or American officers on the ground in Syria or Iraq anymore. And the gulf between journalists and the military in the field is huge, huge.
But I suspect we still get more than dealing with the Saudi military, correct?
Well,
we rated the Saudis more transparent than the Dutch, for example. The Dutch were so bad, we actually hired a full-time advocacy officer in the Netherlands. They were the worst of the entire coalition, the Dutch. The Saudis, the Jordanians, the Emiratis were all more transparent. We have this self-idea that we are the best, we are the most transparent, we're good at this. We're not. The British are transparent, let's say. They're appallingly unaccountable. The Americans are not transparent, they are accountable. The Dutch, just the worst of all worlds. Go figure. This lady here, thank you.
I was going to ask, sort of long-winded, but the whole process obviously requires someone to witness, and then someone to report, or people, and then someone to analyse. And at every stage of that, there's some sort of lens or opinion or approach of who's a valid civilian, what kind of harm is worth reporting, and also whether the reporting is representative of that, and sort of how do you reconcile those assumptions and what are the risks associated with it?
Right.
Yep.
I'm just going to draw back to the Cameroon video because it's particularly interesting. One of the people who worked on it who for BBC Africa is actually in the room in the back and was also previously Bellingcat. Hey, Ben. That was taken by the people who were doing the execution. It was technically perpetrator evidence, and they posted it. That had incredible value and was verified using just that video, but by analysing every single bit, every single frame in that video. Like Milena said, everyone was watching this video like 200 times to pick apart each bit that was involved in that video by like trying to identify where it happened and who were the people that were involved in the killing and who were those being killed. And it's one that is really interesting to me because people tend to look at it just from a civilian monitoring perspective, in which like only a person who is a civilian who posts something, only their word is valuable, but actually verified perpetrator content is as valuable as a civilian who is monitoring their strike. And the Cameroon video is a really, really good example of that. It's also a really good example of crowdsourcing and different people from different backgrounds working on one thing. Like, this was something that everyone worked on, and like people on Twitter were posting things trying to identify locations. Like, people spent hours and hours going over satellite imagery, and only knew it was the town once someone had tipped them off. So it requires multiple people, it requires different backgrounds, and it also requires collaborative efforts, which is something that is very indicative of the space, like different people from different backgrounds always coming together for a cause. Although that is incredibly cheesy to say, but it is true. And verifying content is incredibly important, and corroborating content is incredibly important. And in the case of Cameroon, I think that's always very highlighted and very well done, which is why they keep winning awards every 2 seconds. But yeah.
Milena?
Well, I don't know what the question is. Is it about military or?
I think it was you were saying about
the multiple perspectives.
Sort of obviously at every basis, who has access to being able to report, and how do you rely on that, and who is credible as a civilian, and what is harm, basically. I'm doing a bit meta with it, but like, the people do the analysis have a certain perspective on who constitutes a civilian and what constitutes harm. I was wondering like how much you take that into account and reconcile that.
So you're talking about people who might have an agenda that may.
Or like whether you consider like combatants basically in the wars that are being fought in urban areas. How do you know who's a combatant and civilian? How would you show
Yeah,
that?
so, I mean, yeah, we've seen over Syria, for example, the row over what the white helmets were up to and the likes. It's just, I suppose it's just the credibility of the people that you're using to provide you with information.
Yeah, and I think we really have to consider, like, just going back a little bit to Cameroon, that was one of many videos that was coming out in Cameroon at the time. There was a wave of leaks or sharing videos, many of them filmed by military themselves, depicting human rights violations. So yeah, first of all, we focus, harm for us is in a human rights lens. So we have like definitions and international law that we can rely on, and maybe that's a privileged position to be in. But that one question that I kept having in that waves of videos being leaked and everybody working on them is like, why now? Why now? There were, over 2 years after the videos were filmed. It was in the context of elections coming up. It was clear that there's an agenda behind it. It was clear that somebody wanted us to react in a certain way. And we had to think about that. Obviously, that didn't mean that we are stopping investigating, because it was like an incredible, Cameroonian soldiers killing civilians in the name of fighting terrorists, which was something that they always do. So it was incredible, and it was something worth working on, but we couldn't not ask ourselves, why now? Why all these videos now?
Yeah, I just very briefly on that. You're absolutely right. There are risks there, because it's always going to come down to human assessment, and we all have biases and our own values that we bring to allegations. The way we try and get around it at Airwars and many other monitoring organisations is around transparency of what we do. So if you go to the Airwars site and look at an event, you can find every single allegation that we draw from, and we permanently archive every allegation, so you can reconstruct our own method and come to your own conclusions. That's the first thing. You don't have to accept ours. We call our assessment a provisional assessment based on a standardized methodology that doesn't deviate between conflicts, and every assessment remains open for us. So any new piece of information can quite radically change our understanding quite quickly. That's how we've organisationally tried to respond to those challenges. And different conflicts, different scenarios. We haven't seen much faking in Iraq and Syria relating to the war against ISIS, primarily, as I said, because the scale of death has been so catastrophic that there's no value in faking a video, because nobody cares. Nobody's going to distribute it. Nobody's going to do anything with it. And the scale of death and injury is so catastrophic. Why bother? Other conflicts, particularly...
You're starting to work on Somalia now. You'll see how
exactly.
beautiful
You go
that
to
work
other
is.
conflicts, you do see a different scenario. So there's no one-size-fits-all. The risk of fake or manipulated media is there, manipulated testimony. But again, you can capture that, you can qualify that, but I think you should still make it accessible, sure. even so that others don't make the same mistake you might have done in your original assessments. So there isn't one approach for every conflict is somewhat different.
Great, let's have another question. This lady here.
Actually, it's a linking question. It's about the deep fakes and disinformation. How are you preparing for that?
I have a quick answer for that. Well, it's terrifying, obviously, and I think there will be a technological escalation from now on between the, how AI can create these deep fakes and how we can spot mistakes and how we can detect them. What we do that is a project that I love. We call it the Digital Verification Core. We're working with universities around the world, and we're training students into, demystifying content online, into verifying content. They work with us directly on human rights investigations. You've just visited one of the centers we work with. And I think investing in the new generation so that they are much more vaccinated than we are. I think it's as well a generational issue. But obviously technology will play a huge role in how we're able to understand the technology behind it and how we're able to keep up with the verification tools we have.
The issue of deepfakes is interesting for multiple reasons. It's not entirely impossible to verify something that has a level or an extreme level of sophistication when it comes to mimicking through AI. And there are people who've been working on this for the last 2 years. One of them is actually now based at UC Berkeley, and his name is Dr. Hani Farid, but he's been doing this for 10 years and working on deepfakes and digital forensics, and this comes to an entire different field, which is digital forensics. And it's like looking at the metadata in the image or in the video, and not just purely by looking at this is now me nerding out because I'm learning how to do this now, but it's not actually looking at the metadata in terms of dates or people who posted, but actually looking at the pixels in an image and trying to identify through pixelation, through quantization tables, whether something has been modified, augmented, or been completely faked. Like quite recently, someone at the New York Times Visual Investigations actually spotted that you could basically stitch together a new video using one of the tools very, very simply. Do you remember seeing that? It was, all of us were kind of freaking out because we were like, no, this makes our job so much harder now. But literally using Adobe, you can very simply, not even through Photoshop, but
now we can remove objects from
yes. You can just basically remove someone and it looks like nothing has happened.
Yeah, it's terrifying.
Yep. But once it's been saved, the quantization tables in that image will tell you that something has been photoshopped, but because on Twitter and Facebook, the metadata is removed, so you wouldn't be able to tell by downloading that image. You'd have to have the original image that was posted in order to tell. So it's a very, very difficult, complicated, and also a very fresh problem. People are trying to work on solutions on it, and one of those solutions is actually training the new generation. And that generation is terrifyingly good. Like some of the students that I've worked with definitely outsmart me on 99% of things without even trying. But it is something that is being worked on, and it's quite odd, but also interesting.
Scary. Okay. This lady here, thank you.
I just wanted to pick up on the point of social media and governments being concerned about social media being used for terrorism purposes. And I know that we've seen Google and Facebook taking down open source information. So wondering if you could expand on how you're tackling that issue. And also thinking about how open source can feed into issues of accountability. So how that information is being saved to use for criminal investigations at a later time.
Sorry, go on.
I was going to say, we estimate that around 50% of the materials related to a civilian harm event are lost from the digital realm within a year of that event. And on the big events, that can be a significant amount of material. So videos are removed from YouTube, Facebook accounts shut down, people are killed, villages are overrun. When certain cities were taken by the Assad government, entire city archives were lost just like that. So there's a race to some degree, particularly when you're capturing social media, which is where a great deal of this information is. You know, when we went into war against ISIS, monitoring it, we began by looking at local media, but we very quickly found that a significant proportion of the material we needed was in social media exchanges, and how to capture and preserve that became a real challenge. On ICC prosecutions, that's a whole conversation we're all having, and nobody has a good answer to at the moment. In terms of preserving to a level of ICC compliance, there isn't a quick fix out there right now. If I'm on Chrome, I wish I had a button that I could just press that preserved a page, a tweet, a Facebook post or whatever, to ICC standards, but we just don't have that right now. And we should have that, because obviously the ICC has now pioneered prosecutions around social media postings from this the Libya atrocity 18 months ago, where they got their first conviction based on a social media post. So it matters, but I think we're all struggling around that compliance issue, compliance to see that we can, you know, that this material we're capturing and preserving is actually of value for future prosecutions.
So part of what Chris said is incredibly true. It is complicated in the sense that it is a battle right now in which we're constantly trying to grab things before they're deleted, especially with new incidents. But for ones that have already happened, it is very, very difficult to find them. Part of the workflow that like we've now developed at Bellingcat now involves preservation and archiving. Like, things have definitely changed from what Bellingcat used to do, which is just investigations of opportunity, but now we're trying to archive and preserve to the highest standard. And like, we've been working with Syrian Archive, who've been doing this for a very, very long time, and they've built this entire observations database for the conflict in Syria by preserving that content to the highest evidentiary standard. So some of their work has actually recently just gone to prosecutions. One was on Belgium quite recently, and that one, using that preserved and archived content. Preserving it to the ICC standard is an entirely different story, only because everything to the ICC standard is impractical. However, for local justice, so if we were talking about cases in the UK, cases in the US, we're relying heavily on Syrian Archives method. Different people have done this over different periods of time, including HERDOCs, the international, so the IIIM at the UN is now doing this as well. Preservation and archiving is incredibly important, particularly with the work that we're doing now. You can't just work on an investigation, publish it, and then just walk away from it like it didn't happen, especially for cases of transparency, accountability, and justice. Like, you need preservation and archiving, and you also need to preserve and archive in a way where, once it's presented in court, person X doesn't say that this was tampered with, which is why hashing is important, and hashing also involves the quantitization tables that I was nerding out earlier on about. But it's making sure that in that moment is captured and everything around it is captured. There are different programs that we use when we're doing investigations, like Hunchly, which essentially preserves the page that you're working on. Hunchly is great, like law enforcement use it, different lawyers use it, but it crashes your laptop. So, like, if you're doing an investigation, you have like 90 tabs open, the likelihood of your laptop basically shutting down and crying is a 90%. So it's also, like, this entire field that we're talking about is very new. Like, I think everyone that is working in this field is shaping it. And we're trying to come up with different solutions, we're trying to come up with different tools. It's all incredibly new and incredibly fresh, which is why there is a pitfall and an upside to that. The pitfall is that we are struggling. Most of us are underfunded and really, really under-resourced in terms of human resources. Like, Airwars does this with less than 10 people at this point. How many are you? Amnesty's Digital Verification Lab also doesn't have that many people. The highlight to this, and like the definite upside, is that we have the ability to change the way things are developing. We have the ability to make tools based on our problems. What Amnesty did with Decoders was absolutely incredible in terms of an AI and a machine learning platform, which is like identifying damaged buildings using AI. In this case, it was manual, but it can definitely turn into an AI project because of all the people that were involved in it. I was one of like the weird decoders who logged on to the REC website a lot of people were, like it was crowdsourcing. So there are tools that can be made to help preservation and archiving, and people like Syrian Archive, who I absolutely adore because of this, have been doing this for such a long time, and they're actually making headway with it. Like there are cases that they are winning using their evidence. So I'm really glad we're working with them on this.
I just want to take we haven't got much time, so I want to take a few more questions before we close. That gentleman over there.
So this was just a follow-up question in terms of sort of verification in digital forensics. Are there conversations that are happening with folks like Adobe and things like that where if I'm using a context-aware removal of something, whether it's in video or stills, that there's a digital watermark that's invisible that's put in? So if you think back to how anti-counterfeiting stuff was done with photocopiers once upon a time, that this was just hardwired and you couldn't do it, right? So are there conversations happening that says, you know, if such and such, you know, action is performed on the video, we've got an embed that's invisible to the naked eye, very robust to destruction in terms of resizing, all of these sort of things, but, you know, in 5 seconds you run it through the, you know, the backwards verification and we can tell. I mean, Canon sells cameras to law enforcement. So are there conversations that are happening with companies like Adobe to that effect?
I'm guessing this isn't one for Anthony, so I'm going to ask Milena to...
I mean, really quickly, the dream of an open source investigator is to have absolutely all the metadata included in the file. Wouldn't we want to have the location and, you know, everything about that picture, where it was taken, who took it, and whatnot? But that comes at the risk for people who do take those pictures on the ground. So if we do go to that extreme where everything is embedded in the file and all the metadata is available, or like, you know, you can trace back to the source, and you have to always balance the privacy with the needs of verification. So I understand that you're talking maybe about more sophisticated mechanisms, and there's tools out there that do that. There's eyewitness app developed by lawyers. You know, you take a picture on your phone and it's sent to secure servers and all the metadata is preserved and so on. But again, the context in which you can use that is very different, and you know, whether the companies will get there quickly to implement such solutions, it's
maybe my question
questionable.
is slightly different, and it has to do with the manipulation after capture, right? And that because everyone's only using 3 or 4 tools, they're using Adobe, they're using Avid, or they're using whatever else, that this is something that gets baked in so that if you do a manipulation, that, I'm not talking about privacy metadata or anything like that.
But as Rawan was talking about, you know, when images are shared online, they are degraded and they change, and it's going to be really hard to...
They can be very, very degraded, and you can still track it.
Yeah, so the quantization tables are the back end. Like, they're the back end to the cameras, to Adobe, to Photoshop, to everything. Every camera has a different quantization table. Every Photoshop version has a different quantization table. That is essentially the back end that's built into it, but it's built into the metadata. Now, like, you have 2 options. Either you can look at it through the pixels of the image and then try to build a quantization table through the pixels in the image, which takes a very, very long time, or maybe I'm just really slow at doing it because I'm still learning it, but like Hani Farid can do this in the blink of an eye, and they've been doing this for cases about insurance, like a really good case was actually one in Scotland, and it was one of the paedophilia rings, and they wanted to tie back the images that were taken to the cameras in the room because they found over 30 cameras, but they wanted to identify who was the owner of the camera, and so they used the quantization tables in the images that they found on the laptops to link back to the different cameras. So there are ways to have that built in, but it requires the metadata. And I know, like, there are multiple people who are trying to work with Twitter and Facebook in order to get the metadata, especially if there is an opportunity for prosecution. Like, Twitter does save the metadata, it just doesn't make it public. So you have to go through Twitter, and once you go through Twitter, you have to file in court that you need this certain image for this certain case, and that's how you get the metadata. So it's built in there, it's just about accessibility and time that you can invest into it. But your quantization tables are the thing that gets you there. I really like quantization tables. It's bad.
Yeah. I'm not sure I do, but I'm not sure what we're talking about. But anyway, are there any other questions here? Gentleman over there. Thank you.
Thanks. I've got a question that's perhaps more Anthony friendly, which is
Thank you.
we've talked about the sort of commoditization of data, and it strikes me that it's likely that online investigations are going to become more prolific with 5G and the Internet of Things and all the data that's going to be accessible. What does that mean for conventional journalism, and what do you think the future of conventional journalism is going to be competing in that space?
Like any information gathering, you're still going to need a woman, a man on the ground. There's no substitute for that. It's like gathering intelligence. You can't substitute it with a drone or a laptop. You can enhance it, but you still need someone, a leg person, on the ground. So I don't feel the role of journalists like me is in any way challenged by this. I think it's advanced and enhanced, and though I might have been slightly lost on some of the vernacular used, I kind of understood it without being able to re-explain it, if you see what I mean. And I feel absolutely fine about it. I think there will not be a scenario that field journalism is replaced by this level of highly advanced open source investigation. I feel very confident about it. Thank you.
Great. Are there any more burning questions before we bring this to a close? This gentleman here. We'll make this last one.
Just a quick one. It's a fascinating session. If you get a completely closed society, the most obvious one that strikes me is, say, North Korea. No one's getting in or out, notwithstanding the odd defector. Does everything we've been speaking about, notwithstanding satellite, does it sort of break down a bit, if not fully?
Milena, have you got an example of that?
Well, we do use a lot of satellites over North Korea. In particular, we're monitoring prisons and how they are built. But there's people that escape the regime, and we have as well testimonies, and we get to talk to people that were there. Yeah, of course. And, with Raqqa as well, the work we did was challenging because it's not North Korea, but it was under ISIS, and people were not allowed to have cell phones, and internet was scarce. So, we started with the premise that this will be a data poor environment, that we won't have as much as anywhere else in Syria or anywhere else, really. And we ended up with huge volumes of data to check. So even in the most kind of data scarce environments, you can find a lot of information, really. And you need those skills to dig for it. And I think it takes a lot of perseverance and sometimes a certain type of personality. You have a lot of OCD people in the space of open source investigations. But yeah, I think you can find stuff anywhere, really.
That's great. We'll bring that to a close. Don't forget that you can pick up these invites to the Raqqa study that opens tomorrow. But in the meantime, thank you very much to all our panel for a fascinating evening. And if we can give them a round of applause, that'd be great.